I think it's still, nonetheless, possible to say that even though Islam is increasingly present in Europe and is increasingly accepted in Europe, that there are still some real obstacles to it being of Europe or of the European countries where it is developing. And I'd like to sort of speak a little bit about this paradox. On the one hand, there are very few mainstream political parties. Now, there are, of course, fringe parties, but very few mainstream political parties who would deny that Muslims are here to stay in Europe, that they are now part of the national fabric, or that, you know, it's a permanent presence. You can look just at the comments that some of the heads of state and heads of government have made in the last 6 months or so. In Germany, Chancellor Merkel said, you know, to clarify after a kind of messy national debate about whether or not Islam, quote unquote, belongs to Germany, she stated unequivocally, for the record, you know, let's forget this question about whether or not Islam belongs. Islam is a permanent and integral part of Germany, right? It's ein Bestandteil Deutschlands. The new French Interior Minister, Manuel Valls, shortly after he took office, inaugurated a grand mosque in Strasbourg, the Saint-Étienne Mosque, and there were some mixed messages being sent there because he had invited, of course, the Moroccan Minister for Islamic Affairs to attend the inauguration of the mosque. Not incidentally, the Moroccan Ministry of Islamic Affairs had paid for the mosque. But while he was addressing this crowd, the minister, Manuel Valls, said, we need to find ways of making Islam increasingly French, and that includes making sure that it's financed from French funds. Now, this is still sort of lip service, it's still a bit rhetorical, but the message is important because it means that, again, unlike perhaps the ambiguity of the rhetoric of the Sarkozy years, in France, the new government states quite unequivocally and with clarity that Islam is French and it is an integral part of France as well. On the other hand, even though we see you know, these important gestures being made, and not just gestures, but really also institution building, I think it's also fair to say that there is a new wave of anti-Islam populism, and perhaps not just at the margins either. And my thinking is that this is indicative, actually, of Muslims and Islam's gradual insertion into European societies, and so that what we see happening at the extremes is a rejection, not any longer of, well, you know, Muslims should go back home, you know, to where they came from, or Islam can't be here. It's that they're actually reacting to the fact that Muslims and Islam are being incorporated into European societies. And they're now trying to basically negotiate the highest entry fee, if you like, for Muslims and Islam into European societies, now that it is irreversible, now that it is inevitable. And I know that it sounds sort of obvious to say it's irreversible and inevitable, but we have to keep in mind that for most of the post-war period of labor migration, right, from the late 50s, early 60s, up until the 90s, when you have family reunification, where the Muslim population grows from, you know, a couple 100,000 to maybe 15, 20 million, that many of these Western European governments had a kind of ostrich policy, right? They did not want to deal with the reality of this new settlement, and part of the way that they put off the decision to integrate was to keep engaging the embassies of the homelands, right? To keep engaging the embassies of the countries of origin, and to offer linguistic instruction and to offer some religious instruction, but always with the goal of eventual return to the countries of origin, right? And this is, I think, this has always been interesting to me because it's been often mischaracterized as a period of multiculturalism, right? Where anything went, where people could practice and say whatever they wanted. And I think that doesn't quite capture what was happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was less a period of multiculturalism than it was a period of sort of indifference to what was happening in these communities, combined with a moderate encouragement of the homeland cultures, but again with the aim of making it easier for these populations to essentially be resettled one day. Now, that's a very ambitious program. It was never really put into place, but there were small ways in which it was visible. There were incentives to engage in return migration. The French government, the Dutch government, offered money, right, to every man, woman, and child who would take it to go back to their parents' country of origin. Now, those days are over, right? And I think it's very important that we see this as a kind of, as a dividing line, after which there is really no return any longer to a kind of pre-Muslim minority Europe. In the interviews that I've continued to conduct, even since my book was published, I've started another project and continue to speak with officials about the way in which Islam is being sort of inserted into state-church relations. And notwithstanding all of this progress, notwithstanding this sort of irreversibility argument that I'm making here, I still encounter a lot of people, officials, who say that something's not really working, right? Who find that, you know, integration is failing. It can be because there is, you know, a school that is filled with nothing but the children of immigrants, and they say, how can that be possible? You know, integration is never going to take place if they all concentrate in the same place in the city, and if they all refuse to speak the local language. Or they could say, well, you know, I just read a newspaper story about another academy sponsored by the Saudis, you know, preaching hatred against Jews and women, and this is unacceptable. And you know, you encounter a lot of these people who, notwithstanding the progress, are still very skeptical, actually, of the ultimate success of the endeavor, which is to say, of Islam's real integration into the landscape. Now, if you speak with the Muslim community leaders who find themselves in negotiation with the state, you find that they also are increasingly skeptical of the receptiveness of the societies that they are now engaging in as equals, right? They are frustrated with ongoing restrictions against religious liberties, right? So it wasn't enough to have the debate about the headscarf. It had to be followed up with, you know, endless debates about the extremely minoritarian practice of burqa wearing. This was a good example of you know, looking for problems, right? And which a lot of Muslim leaders felt quite annoyed with, even though they weren't ready to defend the burqa. They found themselves in this awkward position of having to have a discussion about something that was entirely beside the point and quite extraneous from their actual concerns of daily integration. They also expressed frustration with the constant focus on Muslim extremism, whereas they see around them a fair degree of right-wing extremism, which politicians seem less interested in tackling. And again, in Germany, this came to a fore in the last year and a half. Some of you may have heard of the NSU murder, which was a kind of neo-Nazi cell that was operating in Germany between perhaps 2000 and 2008 or so, and whose aim was to terrorize the immigrant population, in particular the Turkish population. And this cell of 3 people, one of whom is now finally going on trial, 2 of whom died in a fire, killed 8 Turkish origin Germans over a decade, also killed a Greek migrant and a German policewoman. And this the fact that this could take place in the Federal Republic of Germany, which has this amazing internal security apparatus, right? The Verfassungsschutz. In every land you have really a political police that is observing groups, that is publishing reports twice a year about all of the potential extremists, and which has, chapters and chapters and chapters about Miliburush, about, the 400 Hezbollah members in Germany, that they somehow managed to overlook and be outsmarted, or at least outwitted, by this, this tiny cell of neo-Nazis. And so this kind of double standard also, I think, raises the hackles of Muslim community leaders who are sick of always having to answer to questions of extremism themselves, which they may even acknowledge is necessary, but they want it to be part of a larger discussion about extremism in their society more generally. And so I've noticed a new impatience, I guess you could say, in the process of building state-Islam relations, even though it's been going on now for about a decade. And also a growing skepticism that it will ever really successfully take place, which is to say that the Islamic religion will ever really be fully at home in Western Europe. You will be familiar probably with some of the opinion polls that have come out in recent months that show a quite surprising level of rejection of Muslims and of Islam as part of the national society. Now, those polls had looked very different actually up until a few years ago, but in the last year or two, perhaps around the time when David Cameron and Chancellor Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy were speaking about the grave dangers of the failure of multiculturalism, that this seems to have had an effect on public opinion, because public opinion is increasingly skeptical, right? So you have sometimes 2/3 of French, German, Dutch, British society who wonder whether or not the very basic question of whether or not Islam is compatible with their political system, and who tend to see Muslims as a threat rather than an enrichment, etc. So this, I think, brings us to this really important paradox that's at the heart of early 21st century Europe, which is, on the one hand, you have this process of rooting Islamic organizations and rooting religious practices in domestic institutions. Right? I mentioned the Deutsche Islamkonferenz, I mentioned the Conseil Français du Culte Musulman, but there are 25 Conseils Régionaux du Culte Musulman as well in France. There's the Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board in the United Kingdom. There are imam training programs from the University of Amsterdam all the way to the Complutense in Spain. And this is, I think, in itself, a very revolutionary development. The fact that you have this process of rooting institutions, institutional rooting, and this, of course, has very important implications for the development of the religion itself as a minority religion. You will all know that there have, of course, been periods in history when Islamic communities have lived as minorities under another legal system, but the European experience of Islam is something special because it was really a voluntary movement. Of course, there are some refugees among the 18 million Muslims living in Western Europe, but for the most part, these were voluntary migrants, right? Economic migrants and their descendants. And this raises very, very important questions for what it means to live as a Muslim in a non-Muslim country, right? How do you fulfill your religious obligations, and how do you also live as a good citizen? And that process will have will make waves really across the Muslim world, not only because of the circular mobility of so many Muslims in Europe who may return frequently to their ancestral homelands for a summer vacation, or who may even go back and work for a year or two, to have this real circularity of ideas and of people, but also for these countries' own legal systems, right? Whether you're thinking about Turkey or Morocco, where they're thinking about how their descendants can be good Muslims in Europe, and setting up teaching and religious structures for them here, but wanting it to be a special European experience, right? Wanting it to kind of stay in Europe, right? So if you think about something like the, the Moroccan, European Moroccan Ulama Council, right? That's based in Brussels. They're meant to issue fatwas that apply only to des émereux, right? The Marocains résidents à l'étranger. And as you might imagine, it's very hard to say, well, the following dispensations, right? Whether it's regarding drinking water during work during Ramadan, or whether it's regarding taking a mortgage out on a first home. They may well like for these dispensations to apply only to those Muslims living in a minority situation, but it's virtually impossible to keep that influence in Europe, again, because of the movement of people and ideas and the internet, etc. So the Europeanization of Islam is really far from being a done deal. And I would say that, and this is, now I'm getting to the paradox, that there are two kind of counter-revolutionary trends that are taking place at the same time that we see Islam being inserted into the institutional and political landscape. What are these two counter-revolutionary trends? Well, the first is something that would be familiar for anyone following Dutch politics or German politics in the last couple of years, Islam critique, right? This notion of being able to criticize the religion of Islam per se as fundamentally incompatible. And I read a very troubling quotation